Hey guys, in this video we're going to be talking about sheeting a roof. We're going to be going over chalking the line for your first row, sheeting your first row, and then carrying on with H-clips and proper spacing. So let's get into it. So the way we build our houses, we land our outlookers on every sheeting seam. So that means to chalk our line, we just pull up and we're going about to the center of our outlooker, a little below. We're gonna go 48 3/8 on this roof. We're gonna make a mark at each end at 48 3/8 and chalk a line between them. When you're pulling this line, which we're doing it at 48 3/8 on this roof, we could probably do 48 1/4 would be fine. The reason we're doing more than 48 is so that the edge of our sheet doesn't overhang past the subfascia. The steeper the roof, the higher you have to pull up. On a 12-12, you might have to pull up 48 1/2 to 48 3/4, depending on where your sheeting ends down below. You do not want your sheeting to stick out past the face of your subfascia. So we'll chalk our line here. Okay, for our first sheet, since we have this 1 foot spacing and this 16-inch overhang here, and 8 feet doesn't quite reach it to this truss. So we're gonna put 8 feet on this truss and overhang our sheet. With a 2 foot overhang and 2 foot on center spacing, you should be able to lay a sheet down that's flush on the outside of your subfascia and splits that 8 foot truss in half. So I wanna point out that our second truss in and our gable is already plumb and string lined. So we know that right here is the proper measurement to pull off our spacing. So to get this started, I'm looking for two things. I want to be splitting this truss halfway, and I want to be on this chalk line up here. For splitting this truss halfway, we can't trust it up here. We don't know that this is the right spacing. That's pulled off of this. We're going to use the tail because we already pulled layout when we nailed our subfascia on. So we're going to split the tail in half down there. Then I'm going to put it on my line. Looks like we're splitting it in half. Now I can put a nail down here. Now we're getting the line right up here. We're splitting the line in half. We can set a nail right here on our plumb and strung truss. Then we can pull layout off of this. We got 1 foot and 3 foot. If these trusses are super bad, you can nail that outer L of nails. That will give it a lot of leverage. It will shear the sheet, and then you can twist this around to get it right on your line. Notice I pulled spacing off of this plumb and strung truss. I know this is a good measurement to start our run from. If this is a steeper roof, this first row is going to be very hard to sheet. I like to be above the sheets holding it so I can see the chalk line. But if it's really steep, you can set nails down here to help hold your sheet from sliding off the roof. That will help you get it in place. If you didn't know already, I'm using 2 3/8 inch nails. This is what we use anytime we're nailing sheeting. So for this second sheet here, again, we're just trying to get it on the chalk line. That is the most important part. We know that if our trusses are the right spacing, butting in tight here, we're gonna end halfway on a truss there. I'm just gonna care about this top corner first. This is how you do it by yourself. You wanna get this corner flush here with this guy. I'll put them right on the chalk line. Now we slam them down so it's tight to this seam, and it should be right on the chalk line, which we are. So before we nail the trusses up top, we wanna nail this bottom L. That's gonna allow us to bend the trusses without throwing the sheet off the line. This right here is something you never ever want. If this happens, you wanna pull it out, because when they're sliding their fascia up under here, it's gonna hit this nail and they're not gonna be able to get it in. It's super annoying. So pound these nails out. Whether you're on this lower edge here or you're on the raked edge there. We don't want any nails sticking out like this. That is very, annoying for the siders. Now we're gonna pull spacing on the top for these trusses here. So we already know this truss is in the right space because we made a mark and nailed it on it based off of that truss over there. So we're gonna hook our tape on the edge of this truss, and at each 24, I'm gonna make a little pencil mark. This very end mark is the most important because that's what you're gonna be pulling the rest of the sheets off of. Each end of the sheet is where you hook your tape and continue pulling. So make sure it's spot on. Now we're gonna bump our trusses over to that line and nail them off. When we're nailing these sheets off, we're doing 6 inches on center on the edge and 12 inches on center in the middle. We call this the field. So 6 on center on the edges, no edges up here because we don't have anything to nail to, and 12 on center in the field. So when we do our second and third rows, we want to stagger the sheets. The best practice is to stagger it 4 feet. So the end of our second row will end in the middle of our first row. This is a weird scenario here. We got a 1 foot on truss center layout. So we're gonna have to cut a sheet to go from this truss to the middle of there. We're also gonna cut a sheet to go on this face here. So we got 40 inches to the center of this truss, and we got 7 feet to the center of this truss. The way I'm getting this measurement is I'm holding on the outside of that truss and I'm measuring the outside of this truss so that when I put the sheet on and shift it to center, it's centered on both sides. So I got my spacer board behind here, got my saw set just over 1/2 inch so we can make this cut right in the basket. So for this end sheet here, we want to leave a little gap, and that's so that it stays in line with the rest of this row, because we're going to be putting these H clips in between the sheets, and that space is at almost 1/8. So we got this gap here, we're halfway on this truss, we're flush on the face of this subfascia here, so now we're good to nail it off. We put a lot of nails in here because we have an outlooker running across the middle, then we have our blocking running down on top of the gable truss, then we have all of the edges. Everyone's got a different way of doing it. This is how we do it. So I got all my H clips in this little climbing pouch here, and I just clip them to the back of my belt, and that keeps them out of the way and allows for quick access putting them on. These H clips are so that this edge of the sheet is supported by this edge of the sheet because it's very weak in between the trusses. So this adds strength by supporting it to each other. Because this is a 24-inch spacing, we're putting it in the center, which means it's 12 inches till its next support. Right here, we have a 12-inch spacing. We don't need H clips. Anything below a 16-inch space, I don't put an H clip in. So this part can be a little tricky because you're trying not to knock off your H clips. But I like to get it tight to where my sheet is and then lean it down into the H clips, just like that. You want to make sure that it's tight, but you want to make sure it's evenly spaced. If it's tighter on one side, it's going to kick your row up, and then it's going to eventually mess your sheets up as it goes. That kick will just make every row after worse and worse. That's why this chalk line is so important that we stay on it for the first row, and then we stay evenly spaced as we go. So just like the L we did down there, we're going to nail this L off here, which on the bottom we only have 5 places to nail in. Then we're going to pull layout again and nail the top down. So when my trusses are right on layout, I don't make a mark. It's quicker. You can know they're in the right place. You just leave it, nail them off. Always make sure to put a mark on the end one because that's the most important, because we keep pulling off our spacing. Now we do H clips and just repeat that process. Something you want to pay attention to when you're sheeting is to make sure your nails are set at the right depth. You can see right here, these ones, you can clearly see the head. We're about a 1/16 below the surface. But these ones right here, we're about an 1/8 or more below the surface. We want to try to avoid that. If the nails are right at the surface or right below, then it has the maximum strength. If it's sunk way too deep into the sheeting, it takes a lot of the strength away from the roof sheeting. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that if the roof you're sheeting is getting metal on it, you want to make sure that all of these nails are below the surface. You don't want it sticking up at all, because if you screw the metal down next to this nail, it's going to dimple and possibly puncture the steel. So if you're putting metal on your roof after, make sure to set any nails with your hammer that are sticking up. So we left these sheets hanging long. Now we can chalk a line up our subfascia and cut them off. Always make sure there's no people or tools, anything that could get damaged below you. Now on steeper roofs, you can't really set stuff on here, but a good way to keep your saw up here is to put the blade through the crack of the sheeting, and the weight of the saw will actually keep it there on the roof. So another way of cutting your sheets is to lay them down in place, and as long as your truss is on the right measurement, you can just chalk a line on top of your truss, set your depth to a 1/2 inch, and cut right here. Most of the time, if you're pulling your measurements right and you put your trusses in the right spot, you should split the truss 3/4 on. That puts you right in the center. Now sometimes you get off and it doesn't bear all the way on the truss. If we have less than 3/8 of bearing of the sheeting sitting on the truss, then we will put a board on the side of the truss to make sure it's supported well. 3/8 or less is where we draw the line. Anything less than 3/8 and we'll put that board on. We call it a scab. Something I want to talk about that we don't have on this roof is occasionally you'll get a bunch of weird space trusses. Something like a girder. If you have a girder, which is multiple trusses nailed together, you're trying to pull spacing on it, and yet you have this weird big object here. So when you pull spacing, you always want to pull from the same side to the same side. So on this whole section here, I'm pulling from this side of the truss. So if this was 3 plies of a truss, I would measure over to the edge, and then from that edge, I would measure again. I would never ever butt my tape into the other side. That's how your spacing gets off and everything gets screwed up. So up here, we have to put subfascia on still and finish that out so that we can sheet around this. But as we come down here, you can see that it's about 20 inches, 24 inches to the top here. Normally on the edge you have H-clips, but right here against this wall, we don't have anything to support it. We'll put blocking when it butts into a wall, but we don't put blocking when it butts into a ridge line. Now this piece is over 24 inches tall, so that's plenty of strength. But if this piece was gonna be something like 8 inches or less, we would actually rip this piece down shorter so that we can get a fuller piece there. We're hoping for about 16 inches or more. We don't rip the previous row and the top row unless it's 8 inches or less. The only exception to that is if the top row finishes on subfascia, like here or out there. Then a little piece is fine because it has that subfascia to nail into the whole way, and it actually anchors the sheet all the way across it. When you're starting and when you're ending, you're gonna hit this rake subfascia. And I like to look up it to make sure that it's straight. And you can tap it out. You can see we tap these two out here to make sure that this is straight. We already strung this truss here. So with these couple taps, this is gonna be perfect. When you nail this in with the sheeting, it's gonna lock it in forever. So here we are, we got the roof sheeted and we got blocking underneath these edges. Then we nailed about 6 inches on center on this edge here. Now, when you're nailing your sheets off, you wanna make sure that you're nailing directly on the trusses because that's what holds your house up. So it can be useful to dip your head over this edge and look underneath to see if you have misses on each side of the truss. This should be easier if you don't have sheets like ours where they don't have the lines marked out for where the trusses go. Right here you can see there's lines for 2 foot on center where the trusses go.
So that's how you sheet a roof. Always remember to pull layout on each sheet all the way to the top. That makes it way easier for every step in the project. If you guys got any value out of this video, be sure to check out our other videos and subscribe to the channel, because we're doing a video about every skill it takes to frame a quality house.